All right. Hello, everybody. Looks like we still have some people trickling in, but we have a lot of ground to cover today, so we should probably get started. So first of all, a big thanks to all of you for joining us. I'll introduce myself and my fellow panelists in a moment, but thank you so much for joining our event today on how Côtes du Rhône creates wine programs with value. And it is some serious and exciting value we're going to be talking about today. Big thanks before we get started to Côtes du Rhône, Interrhône, 750 Daily, Marlena, hi, everybody on the team who has made this possible. So my name is Brian Friedman. I'm a wine, spirits, and travel writer. I contribute primarily to 750 Daily, Food and Wine Digital, Forbes.com, Whiskey Advocate. I consult for restaurants, and my first book, shameless plug, called Crushed, How a Changing Climate is Altering the Way We Drink, is being released a week from tomorrow. So I am in the quietly losing my mind phase of the process. Wine and whiskey certainly help. So I want to introduce our panelists today. So I'm just going to tell you who they are. Panelists, when you hear your name, unmute yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from, and then we will get started. So Anna Viducha, she is the owner of Aroma Wine Company. Give us a little bit of background, Anna.
Well, hi, Brian. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone. Well, yes, as you said, I am the founder and owner of Aroma Wine Co., which is a wine brand and communication strategy business. My background is hospitality. I spent about 14 years in restaurant business, have done every job possible in the business except for cooking. So all of that led me to where I am today. The hospitality certainly opened up so many doors for me, and I'm very thankful for this. And to have an understanding of how it works on and off premise and on my end of the business today.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and we're going to be actually leveraging a lot of that expertise that you have. Discussing both on and off premise when it does come to Côtes du Rhône, because I think the opportunities are huge. The issue is making sure that we take full advantage of them. So Anna, thank you. Next up, we have Kat Hawkins. Kat and I have actually traveled together before, so it's nice to see her. She is the wine director for RPM Steak in Chicago. Kat, a little bit of background.
Hello, Brian. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Côtes du Rhône and Interrhône and 750 for having myself and these other wonderful panelists. I have been a sommelier for roughly 12 years, all on the on-premise restaurant hospitality side, kind of at all levels, from my hometown of Detroit all the way to where I am currently at our firm in Chicago. Super excited to be here and kind of share that knowledge and know-how of how these kind of really great wines can fit into all types of programs.
Excellent. Now, I'm really interested in picking your brain as we go on today, because working at, a steak-focused concept, I think there's some great opportunities for Côtes du Rhône there. But also, I don't want everybody to leave here thinking that it has to be, meat, steak, richer things, because Côtes du Rhône also produces some spectacular whites, rosés, and quite honestly, there are some reds from Côtes du Rhône that work with some richer fish, oilier fish, deeply roasted vegetables, things like that. So we'll be talking about that. So Kat, thank you. And last but not least, we have Robert Kavanaugh. Robert is the CEO of Adventure Wine. Robert, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for having me. And thanks to all of our hosts. I've been very excited to talk about the quality, value, and diversity of Côtes du Rhône. This is an area that I have loved for years. My background started off in the hotel side, managing Ritz-Carlton operations in New York City and Palm Beach and corporate headquarters. Eventually moved to the retail side as one of the first corporate wine buyers for Total Wine, and spent a number of years there helping build up the company and watching it grow. And for the past 17 years, I've run Adventure Wine, with our first clients being Ritz and Total and Marriott and everybody else. And we are in the field talking about wine regions such as Côtes du Rhône that have such a great value and diversity and perfect for on or off premise. Happy to be here.
Great. Thanks, Robert. And thank you, everybody. I'm looking forward to a robust conversation as we go on. And by the way, I don't know if everybody can see here in the chat, but Hai just said he loves a great Côtes du Rhône with some curry duck. And I think that's, we're going to talk about breaking out of that pairing box and how Côtes du Rhône can actually help us with that today. With that in mind, just some housekeeping. As always on Zoom events, we encourage questions, comments. Please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. I believe Hai will be monitoring those and letting us know, but we definitely want to hear from you. We want to hear your opinions, your experiences, how you use or might change how you use Côtes du Rhône, both on and off premise. So, all right, here we go. And Robert, I think this is, I'm gonna look at you here, right? You can't tell on the screen, but I'm looking at you on my screen, Robert.
I'm looking at your book in the background. So
man, I got to give
good
you
luck with that.
Now, don't I, for plugging for me? Thank you. I got to sell as many as I can. That COVID rescue dog we got is expensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Can we get a little bit of the lay of the land here, right? Because Côtes du Rhône, right? I think, and this is the case with so many wine regions around the world. This is the case with so many of those sort of quintessential or iconic wine regions around the world, is that we tend to talk about them as single large regions, right? Like all of Côtes du Rhône is one terroir with one microclimate and one kind of soil, and that, which is crazy, right? That's not the case at all. It's not the case any more than any other regions, right? So, there is a huge amount of variation from one village to another, from one appellation of Côtes du Rhône to another. Can you just sort of give us the lay of the land there, both from that pyramid standpoint as well as a little more granular?
Sure. Well, first we'll look at the region overall. It's a 150-mile region just south of Lyon, moving towards Avignon, and then the Mediterranean Sea. You can almost think of it as split into two climactic areas. You've got the north, which is about 5% of the total production of Rhone, and then you've got the big rounded area in the south as you're moving towards the Mediterranean Sea, and that comprises about 95% of the production. It is a very big area, but as you mentioned, it does have a lot of diversity in it, which is why it's able to produce about 75% red wines, maybe about 16% Rhone or rosé wines, and 9% white. All those different climactic variations, you have all coupled with the different terrain, mountains and seas and rivers, of course, the big Rhone River cutting through everything. It just lends itself so well to diversity. And that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to focus on the Côtes du Rhône region, is the incredible diversity, the value, the quality, all kind of combined with the prestige of France. And it is a big area. So it's the second largest producing area in France. So there's a lot there to learn and enjoy.
So I want to dig into this a little bit. And before I let you off the hook, can you clarify something for me? So I'm surrounded by Post-it notes here in my office, Post-it notes in bottles. So you said that there's a lot of climatic variation there. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times the tendency is to hear, Côtes du Rhône, Rhone Valley in general, and to think, okay, it's going to be hot, right? That's not the case, right? It is certainly not a monolith. Can you speak a little bit to how that's maybe painting with too broad a brush? I mean, you touched on it, where it's very different from the north to the south as we get to the Mediterranean. But what are the roles of those different parts of Côtes du Rhône? What roles do they play?
Well, first, you've got a number of different influences. Yes, it is in the southern part of France, but that doesn't limit it to just being hot. I mean, you're on the coastline too. The south is right there on the Mediterranean Sea, so you've got cool winds coming in. You also have a cold northerly wind called La Bise coming through the Côte Rôtie, moving its way down through the northern area to the south. You've got the Rhone River, which acts almost like a wind tunnel. So you have just a wide variety of different climatic influences, as well as different soils and geology. And I think that is one of the things that makes it so appealing to both on and off premise, is there is a lot there to offer. You don't want to think just only red wines. That's a good bit of what they do. It's about 75% of what they do, but by no means is it all of it. Some of the white wines are some of the best in the world, and sweet wines as well. There's a couple of crew that are very sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you say that the reds take up about 75% of production. I think they take up about 90% of the bandwidth or the reputation. But that also means that there is huge opportunity to find some great value with the whites and the rosés, right? That's always one of those.
Absolutely.
Areas. Yeah, I mean, I know when I'm looking at a wine list, oftentimes the greatest value are the wines that are maybe a little bit less familiar, and there's a little more impetus to try to move them, right?
Less familiar and more exciting. I think that's the big thing. We are talking about a region that produces an awful lot of wine. We're talking in about 30 million cases, 9-liter cases of wine. There's going to be producers and varietals that you haven't heard of. 23 different varietals is what this area produces. It opens up a lot of interesting things, and that's the best part. I love going to on-premise restaurants and trying wines that I haven't heard of, grapes I'm not familiar with, and the Rhone absolutely has it. It is the second largest AOP in all of France. France is the second largest producer in the world. There's just a lot there, and that's a big part of what makes it such a good business decision to focus on the Côtes du Rhône. The value, the quality, the quantity, the diversity, and the opportunity really for direct importing and having your own labels.
I love that. I love that. All right, that was great. So I want to jump here. You're off the hook for now, Robert, but don't relax. Anna, I want to talk to you a little bit. Can you talk us through the appellations and that diversity that Robert was mentioning? He mentioned it a couple of times. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between, a bottling that says Côtes du Rhône versus one that says Côtes du Rhône Village versus Côtes du Rhône Village plus the specific name of the village? I mean, what are the sort of key differences there, and why is that so important?
Well, the Côtes du Rhône is generally part of the Rhone Valley, right? So that's kind of like a general appellation that started about in 1937, so a while back. 30 years later, joined the Côtes du Rhône Village, which is a little bit more focused. The wines are a little bit more complex, a little bit more focused. I call it focus, it's probably not the right name, right, Kat? And the Côtes du Rhône Village, with its name attached to it, there is actually 21 villages attached to it. As far as I know, it's hard to find them in the US. There's about 7 of them that are easier to find in the US, but on top of my head, I could think of 2 that I could see regularly on wine lists and retail shops. It's usually Laudun and Plan de Dieu, who are 2 villages that are very well represented in the US.
Why do you think those are so well represented as opposed to the other? And can you just talk a little bit just from a flavor and aroma? Well, I'll use the wine snob word from an organoleptic standpoint, Anna. Yes. What is it about these specific villages that sets them apart? I mean, are they textural differences? Do they taste, smell different? What's the key here for those?
There's texturally different. For instance, Laudun produces mostly reds and whites. The whites are mostly produced from Clairette, which is a little different from other Côtes du Rhône. And the Plan de Dieu are mostly reds, mainly based of Grenache. Okay. So they produce wines that have a little bit more of a body and structure.
Okay. And these, are there any villages that, you think might have their moment in the sun on the American market coming up that we're not quite seeing yet? Are you hearing rumblings from any of them?
Not rumblings, but I would say if you want to go for something that's a little different and close to a bigger appellation like Gigondas, I would go with the Côtes du Rhône Village Sablé, which is neighbor with Gigondas and produces fantastic wines at a really good value.
Okay. So it's almost, it's that, it's almost like that Burgundian thing, right? Where you look for the vineyard next to the really famous vineyard, and you get great value and similar characters. So that's actually a great piece of advice. So is it a very similar terroir to Gigondas?
Very similar, yes.
It is. Okay, excellent.
But if you're able to find them here, it's a safe bet.
Okay, great. Kat, from someone who's, on the floor, from someone who's selling these, talking about these, what do you do most of your business in, right? I mean, it's a fabulous restaurant group that you work with.
Thank you.
So talk through that a little bit, the different roles between Côtes du Rhône and Village and specific villages.
Okay. So I think, first of all, it's super important to recognize that I've had a Côtes du Rhône, just AOC level, as a glass pour since the day the restaurant is opened. There's tremendous value. There is tremendous quality and versatility in the wine. It changes a little bit in its blend every single year, but it's generally Grenache and Syrah. I think guests truly understand that they like blends, and they don't necessarily know why sometimes. I think they tend to be a little bit more approachable, not so complicated, easy to drink, easy to enjoy, with a range of foods throughout their dinner, which is super important. And why it's something that we like to maintain on that By the Glass program. I think as far as being able to speak to different bottling, you have the depth and range of picking kind of where you're at in the valley. So you're further north, you have something that's more Syrah to it, generally a little bit more plush, a little bit more fruit forward, and you can talk about those nuances. When you head back towards the south, you get into heavier Grenache territory, generally speaking. And those wines tend to be a little bit more brambly, a little bit more earthy. And so you can kind of lean into that and say, oh, do you like Grenache-based blends? Do you generally prefer the plushness of Syrah? So you have huge amounts of versatility among a group of vignerons who are valuing their terroir, who are valuing their land. And I'm sure that you'll get into this coming up, but it is special and important to mention that when winemakers really value the place where their wine is coming from, it ultimately shows through in the bottling to the guest at the end result. And I think it's really great that we have the ability as buyers to pick out these wines from people who truly care and push them into the marketplace and really talk about them at the most base level.
Yeah, Kat, I love that, because we've all heard a million times before that, wine is the greatest lens through which to see and understand and experience a particular patch of planet Earth, right? So it's the best producers, and the Côtes du Rhône has an extraordinarily high percentage of producers who really do value that particular land and want it to shine through with as much clarity as possible. And I think that's more and more important to consumers these days than ever before. Are you seeing that as well with your guests, that they care more about this?
I think that they want to care, and that oftentimes the language through which we discuss caring for the land, biodynamics, sustainability, natural wine, organic farming, I think there's so many different ways to talk about it that aren't necessarily clear, but that people understand that that's what they want, or that's what's right moving forward. And kind of really digging in and doing the research on the Côtes du Rhône and their initiative. I think they're trying to simplify that language and to just be able to have people understand that any of these levels are going to be good for the wine, good for the planet, good for everything involved long term. So if you're moving the needle even a little bit in the right direction, that's a good thing. And supporting those people is also a good thing.
I love that. I love that. And I think that's an important point you make about clarifying as much as possible the language that we use to speak to people who are not necessarily in this business, to really highlight why these issues are so important. And later on, actually, in about 15 or so minutes, we're going to be talking about the biodiversity, climate change, the environment, because Côtes du Rhône really has become a leader in that. But I do want to jump back now to Robert. Can we talk a little bit about the blends here, because Kat said something I thought was very interesting. And she said, and I'm looking at my 8 millionth post-it note of the day. She said a lot of guests and consumers like blends, but don't necessarily know why that is, right? And we've all heard that before. I mean, I've certainly heard from consumers, you know, oh, well, I only drink single variety wines. I never drink blends. Well, you know, you've probably had some great Côtes du Rhônes in your life. And, you know, anytime you buy like Napa Cab, it's a blend probably. So can you talk a little bit about what, you know, not just why Côtes du Rhône is so conducive to that, but maybe the kind of opportunities that provides from an on and off premise standpoint?
Sure, and we'll start with some of the whites, because you know they are a big important part of the Rhone Valley. You've got grapes like Bourboulon, you know, meant to gain with Viognier and Marsanne and Roussanne, the famous grapes. What I always teach when I'm working with retailers or restaurants, the sum is better than the parts. Every grape has its own personality, whether it's the rich, ripe, melony flavors of one grape coming in with the sharp, acidic, tropical fruits of others. If they're white wines, red wines, primarily, you've got the big, rich, bold, dark fruit, dark berry, black cherry flavors of a Syrah coming in with the elegance of a Grenache or a Mourvedre. And it's just in fantastic different opportunities. Blended wines, there's a reason why some of the top trends are towards big, bold red wines. And that's yet another reason to look at the Côtes du Rhône area. You look at the top 5 trends, and Côtes du Rhône covers a number of them. Rich, buttery white wines, rosé wines, fruit bursting rosés, and bold red blended reds. Just fantastic. It's opportunity. Different grapes, different blends, you know, thousands of different possibilities.
Yeah, and this is a great point. Is I think a lot of times, first of all, you'll rarely find a restaurant with, you know, an even halfway decent wine program that doesn't have a by the glass Côtes du Rhône red.
Sure.
You will not find a retailer at every level across the spectrum that doesn't have an at least decent selection of Côtes du Rhône. But I think this is a good point, and I love that you brought up the whites, is that the go-to is to go to the reds. But those whites, I've often found, a sommelier friend of mine once said that she actually likes Côtes du Rhône whites specifically because if you get those tables, right? Or you get those customers in retail, they say, well, you know, I drink a lot of rich, oaky, buttery Chardonnay, but I want something different. I want something with a little more energy and liveliness, but I don't want a Sauvignon Blanc. White Côtes du Rhône is like, that's your home run right there, right? And I think that's changing that conversation about the go-tos there. Please, go ahead.
Well, I think you actually hit it perfectly the way we're trying to describe it. On the one end, you've got light-bodied, crisp, highly acidic whites, and there's a number of varietals that fall into that. And on the other end of the spectrum, big, huge, oaky, buttery, toasty Chardonnays in general. In between, a lot of the Côtes du Rhône wines fall in between that, touching into both of them, depending on the different blends. Viognier, I absolutely love. Bourboulon is a grape that maybe not a lot of people have heard of, but it's very, very important in those white wines. I always say that the proof is in the glass. And if someone says, you know, well, I only drink Sauvignon Blanc or Riesling or Pinot Gris, I said, well, we'll try this. And because there really is something for everybody at the table. And again, it does come into that blending. That blending offers so many different opportunities, which is why it's natural for restaurants to very rightly have several of those be by the glass.
Yeah, absolutely. And also by the bottle. I mean, certainly you can get some very high end by the bottle options as well. Anna, from your perspective, you know, this is the wine consuming public in the United States is really sort of, it seems like it's shifting very quickly, whether or not it's an inflection point or getting there. There's some big changes going on. And it seems to me that there are this sort of critical mass of consumers coming up who are thirsty, pun intended. I will appreciate this. We're all about the dad jokes here, but who are thirsty for something that's a little bit different. right? For something that's a little bit unexpected. So from what you do, right? How are you sort of looking at this almost repositioning of Côtes du Rhône and the village and what they're capable of?
It's basically, in my line of work, you always have to position yourself. I have to see myself as a consumer and how I would see the product, right? For instance, talk about rosé season.
Mm.
Rosé has exploded in the US since roughly 2007. That's when a lot of events started popping up, rosé events, etc. And it was all about Provence, which I think it's a miss because there's so many beautiful rosé wines coming out of Côtes du Rhône, for instance, that you need to position as different, interesting, more food friendly than their Provence counterpart, because I found them to be more and more generic at times. So I think Côtes du Rhône, in that sense, could gain that space with the consumer because they're always looking for something different and interesting. And we're lucky now that people can get information from anywhere. There are, you don't need to go into the library to look up wines. It's at your fingertips. So we are here in what I do. I place Côtes du Rhône as the go-to. First of all, it's always a go-to for, wines under $20. Great rosé are different than anything else. Great food wines, no matter what the color, they're great wines for Thanksgiving. They're great wines, during parties. They're great summer wines. So there's a lot of different positioning where that appellation could actually fit into.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point, is that the key grape varieties of Côtes du Rhône are so conducive to making spectacular rosé. And I'm glad you caught yourself, Anna, because you said rosé season, and then you said, and I think I saw all of the panelists kind of go, stand up, sit up a little straighter, right?
No,
because
there's no rosé seasons anymore.
Beat that drum all the time, right? Rosé season goes from January to December. You can take January 1st off, but don't take that day off either, right? And a lot of the Côtes du Rhône rosés, I have found, even some of the ones that are a little more Syrah heavy, even after they're no longer the new vintage, I find that they actually can age for a year, 18 months in really interesting ways. And you start getting some of those more spicy, savory characteristics. And there's a whole other sort of range of purposes that they would serve. Is that a fair statement?
It is a fair statement. I actually prefer my Côtes du Rhône rosé being aged a year. I think that they bring out a lot more flavors than when they just bottled and come out in markets.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I'm at least seeing more and more wine lists where, it's not like it has to be that very freshest vintage of rosé on there. I am seeing some back vintage ones. Some of it, I wonder, I was noticing as we were coming out of the first scary lockdown phase of COVID, where restaurants were sitting on some back stock, and there were some older rosés. And I think for a lot of professionals and consumers, that was maybe an opportunity to say, these do age pretty well. I mean, not 5-10 years, but a year or so can be fascinating.
It was.
Yeah. So all right. So I want to talk a little bit now about organics, biodynamics, because this is sort of the elephant in the room. We can't talk about wine responsibly without talking about this, without talking about environmental responsibility, climate change. So Kat, I'm curious, is this a from a sales perspective, is this a selling point for you? Is this something that you're finding your guests care more about? And as a professional, why is it something that we should all be focused on and concerned with, whether or not grapes are grown organically, biodynamically, and so forth?
I think to kind of answer the first part of the question, there's certainly more conversation with guests at tables that ask me, is this organic? Is this biodynamic? Is this sustainable? And I think a lot of the buzzword is organics, right? I think sometimes that the perception is if a wine is organic, that it's somehow better for you, which I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's certainly better for the environment, right? And it's certainly better to support those that are taking care of the land and the people and the process, you know, from the beginning, you know, from growing the grapes all the way through the bottling line and, you know, what they're using in their business. You know, reduction of paper, reduction of waste, using plant-based inks. I don't think that guests even realize that that's part of the process. So it's a very cool part of the conversation to be able to have with guests, is saying, you know, everything from the grapes in the ground all the way to the bottle on your table. People are taking active measures to reduce waste, recycle different materials, and really just looking at to make this sustainable long term. And I think they're intrigued by that also. I think it's certainly a story to be able to talk about these groups of people, these vignerons, these associations who are being super innovative at every level. I think that's an interesting part of the sale and the story, and that's what everybody wants. They don't want me to just walk up and tell them this wine is good. They want me to tell them why in any number of ways, right? It could be the way it tastes. It could be the versatility at the table, which Côtes du Rhône absolutely has. You know, back to Robert's point, being a blend, these things are extremely versatile. And it could be as simple as what organics and biodynamics mean to a particular winemaker, to a particular brand, or to a particular region.
Right. And I think that reminds me, Kat, of something that a friend of mine said to me recently. And there's so much talk about how consumers in general, not just of wine, but just consumers. And it's always the big moonshots that we're told will make the biggest impact, right? Get an electric car. Not many people can necessarily afford to drop everything and buy a brand new Tesla, but you can, in your buying decisions, have a big impact. Even, you know, deciding to buy a wine that's organic or biodynamic, deciding to support producers who are doing the right thing. And it's not just an environmental issue, right? It's also a social welfare issue because the people that work in the vineyards and tend the vines, these are all more and more important, I think. So I think you bring up some important things. Robert, can you talk a little bit then about, you know, why Côtes du Rhône is so well situated in this regard, right? Is there something inherent to the Côtes du Rhône area that makes it possible for them to be such leaders in organics, biodynamics, and environmentally responsible growing and production?
I think a lot of it has to do with the vineyards and the education that's coming from the French, with the emphasis being put on the biodynamic and organic growth. Part of that is not just social responsibility and business responsibility. There might also be some benefits to the industry overall. Maybe one reason that's really spurring a lot of this, which is probably needed. And a lot of it also may have to do with the overall perception of quality. And when it comes to the Rhone Valley, it can be a little bit confusing, but when we look at the number of villages, 171 AOC Côtes du Rhône, moving up to 95 village, you know, there is something, everyone's looking for something to kind of stand out a little bit. And that may be one of the reasons, but I think we're definitely going to see more and more of this in the coming years, not just from the Côtes du Rhône area, but all of France and indeed all the EU and other areas as well.
Right, right. I mean, it's just beneficial from every perspective, right? From the people working to the businesses to the environment. And before we go on, I know Hai just put this in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, comments, personal experience with Côtes du Rhône, we'd love to hear from you in the chat and bring it up to the larger group. I guarantee if you're wondering about a question or three, you are not the only person there. So feel free to put it in. Okay. So Anna, and then I want to get back to, you know, on and off premise and opportunities for this, but, you know, can you talk a little bit from a marketing perspective about how maybe this movement towards responsibility, towards responsible production and farming has shifted in recent years from what you do?
I mean, especially in Rhone, for instance, there are a lot of producers that have been farming biodynamically for decades. There's nothing new on their end. It's probably new for us because we're talking about this more and more and more. And the consumer is really curious of knowing where the product is coming from, how is it made, etc. A lot of producers have been farming biodynamically for decades, like I said, and it's not on the label. It's nowhere to be seen. It's not a certification that you stick on a label and you could put on your shelf and sell it. It's all about knowledge and education. And luckily, the consumer could now scan a bottle, pick it up, and read a little bit about the history of that wine. But for instance, when you pitch a wine to a consumer or anyone on the marketing end, it's very important because we're all becoming more and more aware of what we're eating, what we're doing, the air that we're breathing. Everything that we're doing on a daily basis is a lot more important to us in terms of global warming and everything. And everybody wants to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So knowing where your product is coming from and how it grew and how it landed in a bottle, it's very important on the marketing end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that reflects an increasing focus among consumers, whether it's on or off premise. So I do want to jump now to, the buy the glass, buy the bottle opportunities, and where Côtes du Rhône wines sit in an on-premise program. And Kat, you alluded to this a little bit before, where you've always had a Côtes du Rhône red by the glass. That's just sort of standard operating procedure for you. But what are the other opportunities for these wines in general, aside from or in addition to that quintessential by the glass red pour?
I think the whites are particularly high in quality, and they're a wonderful tool in your belt when trying to pair with different types of food. Now, I do work in a steakhouse, however, we do serve a lot of seafood and beautiful shellfish, and we run specials of all different types of dishes and influences of cuisine. And I think that the white blends, especially when they're heavy on the Marsanne, Roussanne, Viognier track, they have weight, they have texture, they have tons and tons of complexity that people don't realize, right? It's something that I would challenge everyone to work with more, including myself and my teams, just because it does have this beautiful nuance. And it's one of those things that, because they're so complex, they kind of check all the boxes across the table, right? When someone's asking for, maybe the weight of a Chardonnay, the nuance of, a Riesling or a Pinot Gris, something with a little bit of crispness to finish, sometimes that Sauvignon Blanc has, or when people really enjoy the richness of white Bordeaux. You have all of these different components in these blends that you can work with to kind of fulfill the needs of the entire group, which I think is why they're so versatile.
And also, and we have to talk about pricing here, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
when we're talking about Napa Shards or white Burgundy, whatever it might be, I think that there is a widespread and fairly well-established set of expectations that guests have, that I'm going to spend X on my Chard, or I'm going to spend Y on my Sauvignon Blanc. And I would argue, and tell me if I'm crazy or if this is maybe accurate, that because of that lack of that same level of familiarity with the Côtes du Rhône whites, there's maybe an opportunity there for you to increase what you're charging, right? Your margins can be a little bit better with that. I mean, there's still tremendous value for what these wines cost. And that lack of familiarity, I think, can be leveraged, no?
Absolutely. I think anytime there's the kind of lack of familiarity, or you're trying to move the needle a little bit, you're making a change, you're opening the door to something that people are unfamiliar with, as long as the quality is there, which it is, you can, as a business person, charge a little bit of a premium in order to introduce these wines, which is something that's helpful when you're running a program. And I think that value also lies in the rosé as well. And like you mentioned, sometimes things that have had a year or so, 18 months in the bottle, they tend to become more complex, a little easier to pair with food. And so there's value there because you're getting depth and complexity at a price that people are willing to bet on, right? I don't have to charge $25, $30, $35 a glass for any of these wines, but I can charge enough to make a little bit better of a margin and still believe in a really wonderful product.
And anytime there's that opportunity for engagement for a hand sell, then that sort of, maybe we'll use the term, that more organic seeming upsell becomes a great option. You can talk to them about how the Mistral is a big help in growing the organic grapes. You can talk to them about the overarching sense of responsibility there. And, you know, spending an extra couple of bucks all of a sudden seems like the right move. And it is, right? Like I think Robert said that, you know, the proof is always in the glass itself, right? And you get this great wine, red, white, rosé in the glass, and you've converted people, you've made fans, right? But how do you do that off premise? Robert, can you speak to that? Because that's a little more challenging, right? You can't just say as easily, let me give you a splash, whatever it might be. So what's the role here off premise?
Well, one of the things that we love to do, and we've only recently started doing this, is we do little contests with a lot of the retailers. First, we look at the area general. What we're actually trying to do is to get them more familiar with the pyramid of quality that comes out of the Rhone. So there's 171 Côtes du Rhône villages. Try that this week. So we'll be working a little bit on that. And then next week, we're going to move up to 95 of them are named Côtes du Rhône Village. And then after that, we've got 22 named villages. So let's spend a little bit of time on that. And then we'll dig a little bit deeper, both with the staff as well as the customers. We have customers that come in all the time. They're looking for, try to find the 22 named Côtes du Rhône Village. 3 of them may be 100% red. Try to find which one they are. So they do a little digging on their own. It's a lot of fun. But what it really does is we're moving them up to the 19 crew is they are experiencing all the different levels on their own, and they're doing it in a fun way. Part of the reason that we really enjoy working with the Côtes du Rhône people is there is just such a huge amount of opportunity to educate people. We've seen customers come in knowing there is the Rhone Valley, and then a few weeks or months later, they're talking intelligently between the different levels and wanting to try different crew. And there's 8 in the north and 11 in the south, and we're really turning them into fanatics, and that's rewarding.
And it's actually a great place to become a fanatic of, because there is such a huge range here. You could spend a lifetime, or the proverbial lifetime, studying this and still just scratch the surface, right? I mean, it's constantly changing. Yeah,
and there's so much there, and it goes across all of them: reds, whites, rosés. Even a couple of sweet areas, couple of areas that have some Vin Doux Naturel. I mean, there's so much there.
Yeah, Vin Doux Naturel is a fascinating category. I think that that, talk about an opportunity for hand selling something, Kat, right? I mean, that's even just explaining what does this mean, and is it naturally sweet? How does that sweetness come about, right? Right. Is that the kind of wine that we're seeing, maybe Robert, maybe this is you, Kat, or Anna, maybe this is you. But are any of these wines sort of breaking out of their box at all? You know what I'm saying? Like, I want to talk here a little bit about the consumers who are buying these, right? Both on premise and off premise. Are we seeing any sort of bifurcations or differences, between who's willing to be challenged and taste something new? Any of you can take that. Maybe we'll talk to Anna, because this is a marketing thing.
Well, I have to say, people still have this notion of sweet wines that are somehow not in the right place. Sweet wines are still seen as almost an underdog. So it goes back to educating, right, Robert? You have to educate people on what it is and what it could be paired with. I think the misconception is to pair dessert wine with desserts, which I absolutely do not like. It's the worst
agree.
pairing, I think. So this all goes on with educating. If I were to pitch that wine, I would probably also pitch recipes and send ingredients for people to try, and just to kind of break that barrier about sweet wines.
That's interesting. And this is a fascinating topic about how we communicate the selling points of Côtes du Rhône, of the village and the individual villages and styles themselves. So is there a specific language or vocabulary that all of you, and I'd like to go around the circle here, so we'll stay with Anna, then we'll go counterclockwise, Kat, and then Robert. Is there, a language that you use that makes these wines accessible and gets people excited about them both on and off premise? How do you go about that?
You just have to sell them as wines and not dessert wines, because there are wines, mostly, and kind of open people's mind about pairing. I think it's very important to talk about dessert wines and pairing with savory dishes. And that's when you're kind of opening that door of, oh yeah, let me try that. This is interesting. I never thought of that. So this is how I go about with these types of wines. And it does open up some doors and some palates to people who have never thought about it before.
And do you use that same language, that same philosophy when discussing the reds and the whites and the rosés as well?
Absolutely. It's all about pairing, enjoying, and versatility across the board.
Yeah, that food friendliness is a great point of entry for a lot of these wines, right? As opposed to, overwhelming people with facts and figures, and this village is different than that village in the beginning. Maybe talk about how this village will pair better with that curry duck that I was talking about, whereas this one is maybe better with a steak au poivre or whatever it might be.
Yes, it's all about food pairings and price points, honestly.
Yeah.
You can't go wrong with the Côtes du Rhône, because even if you spend $20 on the Côtes du Rhône, it's not that much to try something you've never had before. And chances are you will enjoy it.
Right. At retail for under $50, you can get into 2 or 3 bottles and bring them home, taste side by side, and really start to intimately experience these differences.
Exactly.
Kat, can you talk a little bit about your language for this? I think the way we talk about these things on the floor also is important.
Absolutely. So I want to touch briefly on sweet wine and sweet wine as a pairing. Something that a lot of folks don't think about is sweet wine with really rich steaks. So when you're dealing in super high end, like Japanese A5 Wagyu, you have all of this high fat content. And to take a sweet wine and pair it, oftentimes sweet wine has a really, really elevated acidity level that's being masked by some sugar that's in there. And so it becomes the perfect, more delicate kind of pairing to have that sweet richness with that kind of acidity in the background to make sure that all of that fat and marbling is balanced out. The other thing that's super important is you're dealing with like a sweet and salty kind of component. Because sometimes those really rich beef dishes can kind of come off as salty and really, really savory. So having the sweet wine to counteract that is also something that's pretty pleasant. Think of it as the same reason why folks enjoy blue cheese and sauternes, right? It's the same kind of principle, except you're not using blue cheese, you're using really savory char grilled steak. So that's always a pairing that people are surprised by. And it's something that myself and my team really enjoys doing as kind of like a mid-course, right? If somebody goes in for those delicate kind of couple ounce portions of any of the snow beef or the olive beef, we go immediately to some sort of sweet wine pairing to kind of connect those dots, just as something fun and experience driven that you don't really think of or have anywhere else. I think also in terms of pairing, or in terms of like really getting to talk about producers and, nodding back to the different levels of quality, you can often have the same producer on a list at all of those different quality levels throughout the Rhone. And so it can be an introduction to a specific producer, a specific grape, or even the region as a whole you can kind of start at that base level of quality, and you can use the same producer to connect the dots all the way up into, the really, really kind of higher end, crew of their own per se. So it's a fun versatility thing to have.
Which also I think is a great way, and I love that idea, to make someone into a lifelong fan of these wines, student of these wines, to get to, you have that control basis of the producer, but seeing how that producer is translating the different appellations, the different quality levels. I think that's very, very interesting. Let me ask you before we go to Robert, do you ever get pushback to, someone, A5 Wagyu and a sweet Côtes du Rhône, or are they comfortable? They know that they're in good hands there.
I think generally what we're doing is, just really kind of being encouraging, and we oftentimes will split pours among a table too, so that way it's a little risk with high reward. You don't have maybe the full glass. You're splitting a glass between 3 people for a couple of bites just to have an experiential type thing. So it's pretty easy, and like I said, it's low risk and high reward because they get to try something that they don't think they would have ever tried before.
I love that, low risk and high reward. Robert, you talk us through the language here, but on an off-premise basis. And by the way, for those of you who didn't see, Hai just put in the chat, if you do have a favorite pairing with Côtes du Rhône, please put it in here. He needs dinner ideas, but also I think it would be interesting for the conversation. Robert.
Well, first, I think it was great that Anna talked about not stacking sweet on sweet and trying something different. As a former bartender, I try to avoid sweet on sweet, and I think that's a great idea. And the fact that Kat talked about sweet wines with savory dishes is also fantastic. Whether we're working with waiters on the floor at the Ritz-Carlton or people on-premise in the aisles of off-premise, rather, less is more. We're trying to build up a relationship with the customer. And it's usually just the smallest thing. Try this wine cool, but not cold. It almost invites the question, well, why not try this sweet wine or this rosé wine ice cold? Well, you're going to mask some of the flavors. And we try something like, to Anna's point, take a sweet wine and maybe a pungent cheese, or even a soft creamy cheese, some smoked nuts and some dried figs, some dried fruit. You have a course right there. I mean, the bottle is already sold at that point. Customers are interested in that, and it's your voice and your tonality and inflecting a little bit of excitement into these wines, whether they're white, red, rosé, sweet. A lot of it is small steps will bring back big rewards. And customer service is all about doing something for a customer, not to a customer. I'm not as concerned about selling wine as I am trying to provide a really good experience where they'll come back to, say, Kat's Restaurant, where they can try some different food pairings. I think out of the box thinking is fantastic.
Yeah.
So
it's a great point. It's a great point. So look, as we come up on the end here, there is one thing that we have to talk about. And we've sort of touched on it tangentially a little bit. And I'm going to respect everyone's time. We got about 5 or 6 minutes left. But I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about how Côtes du Rhône, the AOC as a whole, really does support the sense of biodiversity, protecting its terroirs, guaranteeing transparency in the making of its wine. This is something that is more important now, both in reality and from a consumer perception standpoint, than it's ever been before, right? I mean, we're living in an age of obvious climate change is having huge impacts on the wine industry. Is this something that you all are seeing as becoming more and more important to consumers, as well as to colleagues from your different points of view? Anna, you want to start off?
Yes, it's definitely a question people ask right away. Whatever you pitch to a consumer or in marketing, the first question that comes up is, how is this wine farmed? How are the grapes farmed? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And I feel like people make an assumption that, like Kat was saying before, if it's organic, it's great. If it's not, it's lesser than a wine, but not really. We also have to look at conditions and what wine growers have to work with but more and more producers, as we know, are moving towards more natural practices. And I mean, it's definitely a question I get asked all the time. How is this wine made? Because it goes into a category, right? It's like the under $20, oh, organic wine, and under $20. It's even better.
Right. And Côtes du Rhône is a leader in that, right? For under $20 and organic or sustainably produced, that's a home run.
Home run for
yeah,
everyone.
absolutely. Kat?
I think that what I see the most is, yes, I do have guests asking, but for example, Brian, when we traveled, everybody was so proud to be able to say how they took care of their land. And I think that's where the conversation truly starts. And in almost every region I've been to, everybody is so proud to have you walk the vineyard and see their cover crops or what they're doing to mitigate any sort of negative impact that their operation has on their immediate environment. And I think that is part of the story. I think that's what we can translate when we talk about the wine or the producer on the floor, and people like to hear that. So I really think that's where it's so incredibly important, is that the producers themselves are proud of that.
And they should be, and that, I think it's a good thing that is really starting to, or continuing to become that much more important to consumers as well as to buyers, right? I mean, that's certainly, I would imagine that all of you, the wines that you choose to work with, if they're better for the people making them and the environment, and that would make it even more appealing. It's just another layer of virtue. Robert, what are you seeing?
Mostly on the off-premise side, we're seeing a little bit more and more. There is more of a familiarity with it. We are seeing more high environmental factor status and designation starting to come in, and I think it's just going to continue growing more and more as far as being the importance to both buyers. On any given day, I'm on the phone with maybe 10, 12 chain buyers a day, and maybe 2 or 3 on-premise resorts or restaurants. It's starting to happen. So
yeah,
more.
Yeah, it's an exciting time in the wine world in general, certainly with the wines of Côtes du Rhône in particular. So we are coming up on the end of our hour. If there are no other questions, although I will say that in the chat here, I need to try this combo of Japchae and Côtes du Rhône Rosé. That might be my Monday night dinner tonight, so thank you. If there's no other questions, thank you all for joining us today. Robert, Kat, Anna, huge thank you to Côtes du Rhône, to Inter-Rhône, 750 Daily, Marlena, hi, everybody who made this possible. I think it was a great discussion. We covered a whole lot of ground here. I'm personally thirsty and quite hungry now after all of this. But thanks for having me. Thank you all for being here, and take care, everyone. Have a great week.
Take care.
Thank you.
Côtes du Rhône.